Hey everyone, it's Randy. Today, Kaytlin Bailey comes onto the show. She is the host of the Oldest Profession podcast. She's a writer, sex workers' rights advocate, and a touring comedian. I invited her on to talk about Nevada and prostitution. It is legal in this state, but highly regulated. Caitlin points out that those regulations are so onerous they drive the industry underground and are even detrimental to sex workers who want to follow the law. We talk about that and much more. But before we get to that conversation, a quick message about the Nevada LP. The Nevada LP wants to preserve and expand what the founding fathers called inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and property. Meet friendly, like minded people at LP Nevada events, volunteer, run for office, or donate to the Nevada LP and help take a stand for freedom. For more information, go to lpnevada.org. Once again, that's lpnevada.org. Okay, let's get to the show. And it's the Battleborn Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Sadak. With me is Adam Heyman. Hey, Adam.
Hey, Randy, how are you?
Good, good. And today's guest is Kaytlin Bailey. Now, Kaytlin, we met I didn't meet, but Adam met her at Freedom Fest, which was a couple of weeks ago. Kaytlin, can you introduce yourself to the
Sure. It's great to be here. I'm the host of the Oldest Profession podcast and the founder and executive director of Old Pros. And we are an organization trying to create the conditions to change the status of sex workers in society.
Fantastic. Now, your website is oldprosonline.org, right?
.org. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so let me ask you with the first question, because on your website there is a distinction that you make between what we have here in Nevada, which is legalized prostitution, and you make a distinction between that and decriminalization, I believe. Is
Absolutely. Yeah.
so? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Legalization or the regulation of sex work, right, really is grounded in the idea that sex workers should be contained and controlled, right? So this is like the red light districts that we created, during the Gilded Age. This is an example of like legally licensed brothels in Nevada or some of the mega brothels in Germany or Amsterdam. And this basically creates a unique legal structure around the idea that sex workers aren't just regular members of society, that they have to be, contained so as not to contaminate, right, the communities that they're in. Whereas sex workers have always been members of our community, right? And, at Old Pros, we believe that consensual sex between consenting adults should never be criminalized, whether it's, paid or not. And that the intimate, private negotiations that happen, behind closed doors are not only none of the government's business, but none of your neighbor's business either.
Now, was there ever a time in this country where, because I don't know, I just pictured like it was a free country at one time. We had a constitution. The government was like not as big as it is now.
Sure.
Was there ever a time when somebody could just like hang out their shingle or just like, there wasn't licensing or anything like that for?
Oh, yeah. Sex workers have actually a long history of, sex workers settled the West in this country.
Mhm.
Sex workers famously settled New Orleans. It was a French colony. And, back in the 1700s, the French were very keen to increase the population of white women in New Orleans and around the Gulf Coast. And so they were rounding up public women or women accused of prostitution throughout Paris and basically offering them, would you like to go to jail or would you like a one-way ticket across the Atlantic? Many young women, took them up on that offer and literally built New Orleans. 10% of landowners and business owners in the first, 100 years of New Orleans history were descendants of sex workers. Landowners were some of the, sex workers were some of the largest landowners in the West, individual brothel owners. Many of them funded school districts, irrigation, advocated for, sort of a civilizing force amongst what would otherwise be described as work camps, where you're looking at cities or towns with like 70 to 1% sort of like male to female ratio. So, sex workers, I think, should be a celebrated part of our history, and Nevada is really no exception. There were many, many sex workers who were operating sort of out in the open before these regulatory structures really started, and that happens ironically. It begins during the Gilded Age with sort of licensed red light districts, right, where there's an effort at containment and control. This is something that you start to see in the very beginning of the Civil War, but I don't know, it's like they lost their nerve. Actually, what happened was there was I forget if it was a Confederate or some general was trying to control the sex workers of Nashville, Tennessee, and he put them all on a riverboat to try to send them to another city. And they revolted so violently that they came back and didn't try that again for many more decades. um, you would have so red light districts where you would have sort of legally licensed brothels. Health checks would occur where you'd have sort of a doctor on staff. Folks would pay the line between a licensing fee and a fine was very sort of gray and fuzzy for many years, but they were not rated by the police. These were sort of welcomed, accepted parts of society. I think one of the most famous sort of contained red light districts in the country is, of course, Storyville in New Orleans, famously named after the anti-vice legislator who was trying to control the uncontrollable, ungovernable oldest profession. But in Nevada specifically, the discovery of the Comstock Lode brought a lot of miners out. They were shortly followed by entrepreneurial sex workers, who again were operating in what was quickly sort of becoming a vice town, right?
Hmm.
So sex work and drinking and gambling, but the legal status of sex work wasn't really called into question until the crackdown on the mafia and gambling, right? And so there's some tellings of the history where organized crime essentially sort of like threw sex workers under the bus, right, in order to control the more lucrative gambling or gaming industry in Nevada. There's some really great stories about brothel owners sort of trying to fight for territory, or like would take advantage of the ever shifting sort of county laws or appetites of different law enforcement agencies to crack down. So there was one guy who found an intersection at the corner of, I forget if it was 3 or 4 counties, and so whenever law enforcement would come, he would just like move his trailer like 100 yards across the line, right? But he was able to advertise and tell people to come to the same intersection, and it would just like sort of depend on the attitude of the day at like which intersection exactly he was at. There's another woman who was famously charged with disturbing the peace on a plot of land, but she was the only resident for like hundreds of miles, and so she was she'd opened a brothel on public land essentially, and
Hmm.
the reason that she got some attention is it was an election year, and the opposition party was accusing this president of like running a brothel on federal land. So they charged her with disturbing the peace, or disturbing the public, I think, and she was like,
So
"Come out here."
she ran such a good brothel that she disturbed the peace hundreds of miles away.
Hundreds of miles away. She had what public? What peace? That's
That's a good brothel.
I think I saw that on your website. It was she had to move the tray or whatever it was, but the thing was it was on BLM land, like
Yes.
Bureau of Land Management. Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
fascinating history as far as the
Yeah, and so, the campaign for legalized sex work in Nevada sort of comes out of the same soup that, legalized gambling is. There's a lot of anxiety around needing to sort of control and contain vice. So I think Nevada does a good job, as a lot of vice towns across the country did, of like ignoring prohibition. But when the FBI got involved and sort of started cracking down on the gaming industry, there was a lot more energy around policing the oldest profession. And so the kind of patronizing, I think, indisputably misogynistic compromise that is made is that a very limited number of licenses are issued to politically connected folks that can put enough capital together in order to follow all of these sort of onerous regulations, where then they own the brothel. And a confusing assortment of state and county and city and house rules all conspire to really limit the freedom of movement of the sex workers that are actually working at these brothels, right? So if you want to work as a legally licensed prostitute in Nevada, uh, first of all, you can never have been arrested for prostitution. Actually, you can never have been arrested for anything. You can't have a record, which feels silly and self-defeating to me. Uh,
Rookies only.
Right, yeah, exactly. We don't like these experienced women. Too mouthy historically. So, they're attracting a certain demographic. You have to be hired by a brothel. You have to register with the local sheriff and be issued a license for prostitution. This, of course, becomes subpoenable about you for the rest of your life. You could imagine how this plays out in child custody cases, future background checks. There are a lot of reasons why reasonable people wouldn't want to put themselves on stigmatized lists. Then you have to work for a brothel for 12 or 24-hour shifts. You are not allowed to leave the premises of the brothel, right? You can't run errands, you can't get a drink right off the premises. And all of this is grounded in this idea of thinking about sex workers as vectors of disease, as infections. There's a lot of extra energy around the mandatory SCI testing, which, frankly, it does a lot to prevent STIs. But what we have found is that when you give people access to healthcare, when you stop arresting people for carrying condoms, sex workers generally want to take care of their own personal health. You don't need a mandate, right? That like every 2 weeks you have to subject yourself to the like old fashioned least comfortable way. Like we've come a long way on terms of like how to do STI testing in a way that isn't personally invasive or uncomfortable, but that's not how they're doing it in the Nevada brothels, right? They're like
Mhm.
that they're still doing full sort of invasive swab instead of a simple blood test. You have to pay for that. In addition to having to pay for that, you have to pay for your room and board, supplies that are often mandated by the house. There's a lot of sort of like extra costs that are built in, but what you've essentially done with this model is given full control over to the brothel owners, the brothel managers, right?
That's
They
I'm sorry to interrupt. That's so
Yeah,
fascinating. It's
please,
it's
yeah.
2022, and regulation has managed to make little mini trailer park sized company towns that you only
Correct.
used to ever see,
Hmm.
over 100 years ago. It's freaking
Yeah,
amazing.
it is
And
amazing.
is it the case that I mean, I've heard that a ton of the girls that work in Nevada brothels are imported in from overseas. Do you have any idea how much, what
As
percentage or something?
I want to push back on the language because I think it's really important to say that sex workers are service providers and not commodities. So I would say it is an immigration and not an importing that's happening, just point of order. But yeah, women often travel certainly from out of state. It's just as difficult to hire somebody who is not a US resident or legally allowed to work in the US at a legally licensed brothel as it is, a legally licensed restaurant, right? So most folks that are not legally allowed to work in the US are participating in the criminalized market. But yeah, a lot of folks definitely travel from out of state because, again, as a legally licensed sex worker in Nevada, you're not really allowed to leave the brothel. So folks will fly in and like work for a week or work for a weekend or work for 2 weeks or a month or whatever, and then fly home because it's complicated. Like of if you're a local resident, right, and suddenly there are real restrictions on your freedom of movement. I will also say that like the brothels in Nevada, although they are very well known, represent a tiny fraction of the sex work that's happening in Nevada, right? Nevada is the only state with legal licensed prostitution, and it has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution related offenses in the United States. The overwhelming majority of people participating in the sex trade are opting to do so outside of the tight restrictions of these legally licensed brothels. This
Well,
is
sure.
not a model that empowers workers.
It's where the people are. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, of course.
you drive up 95 from Vegas to Reno, and you'll see the brothels off on the
Yeah.
side of the road. They look just awful. They're just
Yeah,
little decrepit
abandoned.
trailer parks. Yeah, they look
Right.
abandoned, or something where a spooky movie is going to get filmed. You know.
And
I see.
there
I see a lot of parallels between the government regulating this industry as much as, say, in California, where they have overregulated the marijuana industry,
I think
so
there's a
that
great analogy there.
it just yeah, I mean, it drives everything underground. And you can take a
Totally.
walk through one of these strip hotels like the Cosmopolitan, and certainly you will not find sex workers there. I'm just kidding about that. I'm being sarcastic, but yeah, I mean, it's not like it works the way they
No.
intended, I don't think.
Yeah, excuse me, pardon me. No, these regulatory efforts have really only served to enrich brothel owners, which is not like a demographic that I think a lot of folks can get behind, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, it's not a model that works for sex workers. It's not a model that works for clients. I mean, it's a model that works for the rural counties of Nevada, right, where the tax revenue has funded school systems and healthcare systems that they otherwise wouldn't have, but which is one of the reasons why legal brothels are so politically entrenched in Nevada, is that like a lot of folks are making money, but it's not. I would argue that it's not really the sex workers who would be able to keep more of it if they were operating outside of these houses.
Sure, it's a crony system propped up by
Hmm.
government. I'm trying to decide exactly how outraged I should be, because on one sense, this is just the government doing what it always does. It grabs hold
Sure.
of an industry and regulates the hell out of it. Cronyism takes place. But there does seem to be something obnoxious about the fact that it gets extra hard regulation because it's sinful, quote unquote.
Sure.
But then again, as you pointed out, the personal nature of the people involved and what the government is sticking its disgusting nose into is extra galling.
Yeah, I mean, this has obviously been an issue that has activated me on multiple fronts. I am personally offended about what policing prostitution means, not just for folks in the sex industry, but like as a woman, there is a long history of using laws and prejudices and stigma against sex work to sort of limit my full participation in public life, not just as a former sex worker, right, but as you know public woman, right, has been a euphemism for sex worker for a long time. And I think that history is really important to understand. Like the one of the first federal anti-prostitution laws that applied to citizens in the US was the Mann Act, otherwise known as the White Slave Law of 1910, and it made it a crime to transport women across state lines for quote immoral purposes. Now, of course, that meant sex work, but it also meant engaging in consensual interracial relationships. It also meant seeking what was then a criminalized abortion. Just like today, this was sold to the American people as a way of protecting women, right, from traffickers. But we didn't rescue any sex slaves, but we did prosecute a lot of interracial marriages, and we inconvenienced a lot of chorus girls on their way to the next gig. So I think that it's important for folks listening to legislators who talk about their, paternalistic intentions with many of these laws that are meant to protect vulnerable folks, and look at the way that those laws have been applied historically, and it's not been great,
For
really.
sure.
Yeah,
A cynical thought occurred to me. You made an argument earlier that that prostitution in the old days in the old west provided a civilizing influence on a lot of these mining towns, for example.
for
And it
sure.
also famously in the culture we know that we think we know that um, uh, women engaged in prostitution had an avenue to enrich themselves financially and gain a whole bunch of independence from a much more male dominated society than we have now. And I'm wondering if part of these laws you're citing and the extra regulations that crept into the sex work regulatory scheme, I wonder if that had anything to do with uh, men, misogyny, trying to reassert some of the control that it was losing to, free markets with in the sex trade.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that observation. We passed something called the American Plan in 1917, which is when the U.S. gets involved in World War One. This is 3 years before white women win the right to vote. And what the American Plan did is it enabled or empowered local law enforcement to arrest and prosecute women suspected of promiscuity who were near a military base, which is huge swaths of the country, right? And so this was sold as a way of protecting soldiers from the corrupting influence of promiscuous women. And there was no distinction made between promiscuity and prostitution. And so, like, yeah, talk about having an impact on women's ability to move freely through a community, right? If you are eating alone or walking alone, or God forbid, making the wrong kind of eye contact with a police officer, you could find yourself, at a lock hospital or locked up in a jail, awaiting what I think can only be described as a very misogynistic exam, right? And
well,
decide, yeah, it's
well, now
not.
that's just your fault, ladies.
Yeah.
Your vaginas are terrible for the war effort. It's
It's
killing us.
just
Well,
yeah,
I,
and
I
so yes, absolutely, there is a strong parallel between policing prostitution and policing the freedom of movement of women, both literally, like the ability to move about, and then also social and economic mobility. Sex work has funded more female entrepreneurs, more graduate degrees, more artistic careers and endeavors than I think all of the grants for all of human history combined.
Now
Yeah,
you had
interesting.
mentioned the Mann Act
Mhm.
earlier. So that would have been at the height of the progressive era, wouldn't it, in this country?
Oh
As
yeah.
far as so there was, I guess there's that fallout.
Yeah,
As far
we
as
criminalized prostitution, abortion, and alcohol all at the same time, right? And it's
yeah.
all the same group of overconfident do-gooders trying to help.
And get rich while we're doing it.
Yeah.
Well,
So go ahead, Adam.
Caitlin, when we met at Freedom Fest, you were manning a booth right across from ours, the Libertarian Party of Nevada, called, I think it was Feminists for Liberty. Is that right?
Feminists for Liberty. Yes, they are allies of ours, co-conspirators. We do some work together.
So as I'm sitting there manning our booth and looking at yours, I'm thinking, this is probably a bunch of garbage. But I went over and I grabbed all the materials I could find, and I was very impressed. Usually, when I see a X group for liberty, what they're usually asking for and arguing for is some special rights or something
Sure.
to be given to them based on the group that they happen to be a part of. And I'm not down for that. We get our rights from our individual, uh, just being individuals. But that group wasn't doing any of that. It was just pure plumb line
Yeah.
libertarianism with from a feminist perspective, and I
I mean, the
was
big conceit is that women are people.
well, I'm not fully convinced.
Hey, listen, it's
Let's yeah.
You're going a little
Let's
too far.
yeah. Take a step
Pete,
I
back
know it
there,
is a
people,
I
Caitlin.
know that it is a controversial take,
sure,
increasingly so in the Libertarian Party.
sure, you're people.
But
No, but
not
I
like in the
was
way that men are.
I was impressed. I mean, I have no problem with that with advocacy groups that focus on a certain thing. After all, the
Sure.
scope of government evil is far and wide and vast.
There's
So why not?
room for all of us.
Exactly. But what I don't like is when people act like on a different mission or something rather than
Sure.
focusing on the same mission on this narrow avenue. So I just wanted to mention that I was impressed.
Thank you. I think the Feminists for Liberty do really, really great work. I'm especially a huge fan of Ovens O'Brien and Elizabeth Nolan Brown, Kat Murdy too. These are folks that are, I think, doing a lot of really good work. Old Pros we don't identify as a libertarian organization. We seek to speak the language of decriminalizing and destigmatizing sex work in multiple accents, right? So we talk to progressive organizations, we talk to libertarian groups, we talk to harm reduction groups, we talk to anyone who is open to the idea that arresting consensual adults for engaging in consensual sexual activity is wrong and dumb. We're happy to explore all of those reasons through a prism of values that like our listener understands, and principled libertarians I think really get it.
Yeah, there should be room for a whole bunch of issue specific
Yeah.
coalitions for a lot of different reasons. A lot of time will the Venn diagram will overlap where
Yeah.
maybe we don't come at it from the same for the same reasons, but we want the same goal, and it ends up
Sure.
in promoting more liberty for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that there's just so much value in focusing on stopping the arrests. What
Hmm.
we have built through the prison industrial complex here in the US, and just the massive amount of human potential that is wasting behind bars, I think is really an urgent call. And I think that the decriminalization of sex work, the machinery that we built to imprison people for vice, I think is, we are living with that legacy. And now you can sort of see we are using a lot of the tools that were built to combat the quote unquote war on drugs, using it to crack down on, the federal government calls it anti-trafficking, but what they're really doing is raiding mostly immigrant owned businesses, but also a lot of domestic folks, cracking down on voluntary adult consensual prostitution, calling it anti-trafficking raids, and then doing everything that they can to keep the victims, to shut up about what their actual experience of being quote unquote rescued was.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to hone in on something you've already mentioned, but in most of the parts of the country, prostitution is simply illegal. And
Hmm.
obviously, that's bad from a freedom perspective. So you'd think, well, here in Nevada, things just must be exponentially better because it's legal in some regard. But as you pointed out, the regulation makes things worse. I'm a poker player, and we used to have online poker in this country, and it was just awesome. It was the wild, wild west. Nobody knew it was happening. There was no regulation at all. It was glorious. And then Sheldon Adelson and Caesars and MGM got a little irritated at that and pressured the government to just completely destroy the entire industry. And
Yeah.
now it's back, but it's regulated, and it's
Yep.
so awful that you wouldn't catch me dead playing
Yeah.
it.
I can imagine.
And when I look at those sad trailers with those half prisoner sex workers in them, I'm thinking the government regulation doesn't make things better. You'd rather have a black market than a regulated market.
100%. And I think you've really hit on what is a perverse incentive in Nevada, right? By creating a licensing scheme, right? By creating an entrenched structure, right, of folks that are only able to make a living, through these licensing schemes, they absolutely do not want to compete with independent sex workers. They don't want to compete with, escort lines operating outside of, Vegas and Reno, where the highest demand is. And so rather than creating a culture that is more open and more tolerant of sex workers, you've actually created a lot of incentives for law enforcement to crack down on folks that have the gall, the audacity, or the necessity to work outside of the system. So that's one of the many reasons why you see such a high arrest rate for prostitution related offenses, is that, there's a real dynamic where the brothel owners, they ramp up a lot. They use a lot of the political capital that they have to crack down on the competition.
So you're saying we're doubly winning because not only do we have all the evils of prohibition and black markets, but we also have all the evils of a very heavily crony incentivized regulatory structure.
Yes.
Yay, Nevada!
Yay, absolutely. And I've been a sex worker rights advocate now for almost a decade, and I'll tell you, it's folks think that I'm out here defending brothels, and I'm definitely not. I'm defending independent adults making their own intimate choices. I certainly had a great time and found a lot of personal agency and flexibility as an independent sex worker. I can imagine a situation where not everyone's an entrepreneur. There are people that want to show up to work, clock in, clock out. There's a space for brothels, for massage parlors, for folks that run escort lines, right, where you give somebody your hours and respond on call. I'm not against all of that, but I am against this idea of an artificially constrained, right, economy that benefits brothel owners, that benefits these sort of like third party managers at the expense of workers.
Yeah,
Would
absolutely. And one of the great things about the libertarian political philosophy is we don't have to go through and examine every little situation and see which thing whether freedom makes people's lives better in this way or how things should
Right.
be structured. It's pretty simple. Nobody else has the right to say you can't do this.
Yeah.
So butt the hell out. It's amazing we can't get to be more that idea to be more popular.
Right. It's funny too, there's a lot of limitations and restrictions on folks that work at brothels, and there's a lot of restrictions on the brothels themselves. The way that they're able to advertise is very very limited. What this has meant in more recent times is that of course the brothel managers end up outsourcing a lot of that promotion work to their workers, right? Who of course they hire as independent contractors, right? Who are allowed to be on Twitter and Instagram and all of these places, and they'll also use the uh, two-way radio system, right, that truckers use to try to like make calls to the local highway. But there's the artificial limitations have
I had no
yeah, it's just
idea.
yeah, it's a problem.
you're talking about
That's
CB radios? Is that what you're
CB
talking
radios,
about?
yeah, CB. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm
Okay.
not. I was
No,
like,
that's
it's been a
okay.
long time.
I was
I've dated
that's
a trucker.
amazing. I never even considered the advertising that might be going on digitally. Oh my
And like
god.
I live in society, right? Like I could see a lot of good reasons why you would want to limit public advertising, specifically around like billboards or things that can be seen in public. But the solution to this is the independent message boards that we had for years and years and years before the passage of Sesta Fosta in 2018 that tried to remove sex work from the internet. So this is when Backpage was shuttered. This is when Craigslist erotic services disappeared. This is a few years after Rent Boy went down. But our federal legislators, in their infinite wisdom, decided to crack down on so-called child exploitation and violent rape by trying to remove the places that sex workers had been using for decades to schedule and screen their clients. Right. So these are the message boards that I would use, where I would sort of post an ad about my requirements. I would then field emails. We'd go back and forth. This was infinitely safer than trying to make these negotiations on the street or in person. It gave me an opportunity to sort of set expectations and boundaries. It gave me an opportunity to do background checks. There was a lot of harm reduction that was available when sex workers were allowed to sort of openly advertise and negotiate, and critically connect with one another, right? So when these messaging boards were taken down, this is when you start to see sex workers bothering people on dating apps. Like we don't want to be on straight dating apps, right? We want to be on our own spaces where things can be clearly negotiated, but we sort of infiltrating that. You saw a huge uptick in street-based sex work, and of course a subsequent crackdown on arrests really all over the country. And of course, Vegas and Reno, where it is not possible to work legally as a sex worker, was no exception.
what would your if you had your you push the button, this is the way the sex work should be viewed in society. What would that look like if you had your vision as far as there's a stigma in with sex work in society culturally. What would it look like for you as far as how would you Caitlin
We
Bailey's view
Sure. At Old Pros, we are working towards the full decriminalization and destigmatization of adult consensual sex work, right? We seek a society where no one is arrested, evicted, fired, or loses custody of their children just for engaging in this work, and that sex workers, right, and members of our community are allowed to fully participate and contribute their wisdom and experience to the communities that they're already in. I think we have a lot to learn from sex workers, right? From the Me Too movement to mental health crises to, the war on drugs. I think sex workers have a lot to say. And I think that the stigmatization of our work is something that, has been imposed. We have always been incredible contributors to the communities that we're in. We wouldn't have jazz music without the brothels of New Orleans. We wouldn't. There have been whole artistic movements, right, that have been that were only able to thrive because of the community and the culture that sex work and the infrastructure around that help to create. So, I don't think that we all need access to the basic building blocks to move our lives forward, right? Housing, healthcare, the ability to avoid arrest, access to technology services, access to payment platforms and banking services and investment vehicles. And so I think creating artificial barriers to that based on negotiated consent or participation in erotic labor is, to borrow a phrase from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's a boot on our neck that we can do without. I don't think that we're asking for special rights or special protections. I think that we're asking to sort of call off the hunt on the oldest profession and have the ability to self advocate within our own relationships to demonstrate to the people in our lives that we are valuable contributors and have a lot to say. But it's
Well
hard
said.
to do that through the veil of criminalization and, of course, thousands of years of stigma.
Yeah, that's for sure. I was just, as you were talking, trying to parse out in my own head how much of the public stigma towards prostitution or sex work is from the criminalization of it, and how
Much
much is just your garden variety Christian moralism or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, I mean the Catholic Church definitely went to war on sex workers very early in its history, which was ironic because they were the largest brothel owner in Europe for 400 years. But that did nothing to help the stigma. But yeah, I agree with you. I think the most recent iteration of stigma against sex workers, this idea that we are helpless victims, and that we need to be protected from our own choices, is sort of remnant from the progressive era, and is it's a dehumanizing and it, I'm trying to find my words here. Pardon me.
Well, I think
Yeah,
you're
no, it's
right.
a dehumanizing characterization that I think is relatively recent, but the overwhelming majority of the harms, that somebody would cite to say why sex work is negative is the direct result of criminalization. And so this idea that we have of a woman trapped in the sex industry is a direct result of that stigma and criminalization. Once you're arrested, guess what? It's that much harder to get a job outside of the sex industry. It's that much harder to find a place to live, right? To get a landlord to rent to you. It's that much harder to maintain stable relationships, when folks are outed to their community. So, the harms of criminalization almost make the lie true, right? That this is something that once you're involved in, you can't escape. But
Yeah.
I've always said that in my experience, being a sex worker is a lot more like being a waitress than like being a Marine. It's not like I carry the scarlet letter around.
for sure.
Well, it's
Yeah.
it's like you're institutionalized. It's like once you're in the system, like
Hmm.
somebody who's has a record, a jail record or a
Yeah.
prison record or something like that, and
Hmm.
maybe they do their time, and then but there's still that stigma that they have the conviction that they have to disclose.
Well, yeah, the
Totally. I had
prohibition makes, sorry, Caitlin, the
no.
prohibition makes a black market, which makes
Hmm.
all the evils that we think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we
Yeah,
think about a drug dealer, and what we think about is a guy who's willing to kill a guy for his corner of the street corner. But, that's just a guy selling a product. Do we think
Right.
of the guys who, sell pharmaceuticals? Do we think Tyler and Tylenol and Bayer, or, do we think of them like we think of the creepy hood rat or whatever?
I mean, maybe we should.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, these days.
yeah.
Now,
No, we know what prohibition does to markets, and it certainly doesn't make them safer. You said something that triggered a thought. Talking about oh man, I wish you could go back. Pharmaceuticals. You do. I'm sorry. Do you edit this? Is that I'm making an assumption here?
no, we
you
don't.
can,
You-
Oh,
you
never mind.
can.
Great. Never.
Oh,
It's
I say a lot of
you.
stuff. Paternalism,
But
government bad.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
geez.
Government bad regulation. Yeah, yeah.
Well, while you're thinking of it, I'll make another brilliant point. Um, as a libertarian, from the prostitution or sex work issue, I don't, all I care about is that people are free, they own themselves, they free associations. I just don't want the government involved, and the stigma issue is different. That's cultural, or that's how
Mhm.
people think about it. And I try not to worry about that so much, because I just want humanity to shake out however it shakes out. The way we feel about it is the way we feel about it. I just don't want
Mhm.
force involved,
Yeah.
because force always warps and disfigures human society, everywhere and always.
You're absolutely right, and that I think is a good segue into the thought that I was having before, which is, we talk about the direct harms of criminalization, right? We talk about the arrest records and the way that limits your choices, right? We talk about what it means to not be able to access payment platforms or traditional banking and investment services, not being able to invest in your own future because of the legal liabilities. But I think that there's also something to be said historically about sex workers having more access to ways of controlling or limiting exposure to STIs and unwanted pregnancy. And so, sex workers got really a bad rap as being vectors of disease, right, during the 16th, 17th century. A lot of this was propagated by the church, but what they won't tell you in your Western Civ class is that the actual direct correlation, the real vectors of disease, have always been soldiers. That sex workers, because of their own personal interest in limiting risk, have shared knowledge with one another on how to do birth control, how to self-manage abortions, and how to limit exposure to STIs. This is knowledge that is not shared, right, with isolated domestic workers, women entering the workforce during the industrial revolution, where they're engaging with male employees for the first time. So you see a huge spike in STIs, but that is often not attributed to professional sex workers. That is often attributed to sexual assault or other forms of violence that are being perpetuated on women who have fewer protections, both in terms of their access to information and their access to community.
God, I'm just
This
thinking
is
about the parallels between, like, regarding health and
Mhm.
how, like, people who are unvaccinated for COVID. I mean, there's that whole thing about the stigma that they were trying to build around that.
Sure.
But it turns out people who are vaccinated actually end up being more infected, or being vulnerable to COVID than and spreading being a vector for transmission.
I
Yeah,
don't
I
know,
mean,
Randy. I think
Makes
the
sense.
science will show that it's basically whores that transmit everything.
that was certainly what they were teaching in medical schools. Um, yeah.
Well, the other thing is, like, if since there is, you're trying to get rid of that stigma. You're, like you were saying, there's the barrier to accessing maybe even healthcare, like you were
Yeah.
saying. I mean, it's terrible, really.
Once
I
you
mean,
drive any aspect of life into the shadows, you can't expect it to get better.
yeah,
It's insane.
Right.
yeah.
We're a community where everything interrelates.
Everything is connected, for sure.
Well, that's
All right.
been awesome, Caitlin. Is there anything else, any other wisdom you want to drop on us?
No, I'm just, if you like what you heard today, I'd encourage you to listen to the Oldest Profession podcast. We did a whole episode on the history of legal brothels in Nevada, where I go into way more detail. So if I alluded to things you want more information about, I'd encourage that. And if encourage you to sign up for our newsletter if you want to be in the know like an old pro. We provide sort of a newsletter every Friday that covers sex worker rights related news, history, and exciting events coming up.
Fantastic. Okay. Anything else, Adam?
I think it's covered.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for coming on. And this has been the Battleborn podcast. I will put your oldprosonline.org, and I'll put that link in the show notes as well.
Great.
Until next time.